The room was thick with anticipation before the hearing even began. The Senate Oversight Committee chamber had seen its fair share of clashes, but today carried a different kind of energy, something volatile, something personal. Cameras clicked in the background, journalists leaned forward in their chairs, and aides whispered nervously as two names dominated the whispers: Jasmine Crockett and Lindsey Graham. For weeks, headlines had predicted a confrontation. Graham, the seasoned senator from South Carolina, known for his sharp tongue and political agility, had been vocal about what he saw as performative outrage from some of his Democratic colleagues. Crockett, on the other hand, was not one to shy away from confrontation. The Congresswoman from Texas had built a reputation for speaking with unapologetic clarity and commanding the room, whether her words were comfortable to hear or not. As the gavel came down, the hearing began. The topic: alleged double standards in federal investigations. What started as a procedural oversight quickly spiraled into something much bigger, a battle of conviction versus control, truth versus decorum, and two personalities too big to coexist quietly. At first, Lindsey Graham spoke with his signature blend of confidence and sarcasm. He leaned back slightly in his chair, addressing the room as if he were teaching a class rather than engaging in a political debate. "It's not about who's right or wrong," he said, his tone calm but cutting. "It's about consistency in how we apply the law. Some people seem to think outrage substitutes for evidence." The room murmured softly. Graham's gaze flickered briefly toward Crockett, a subtle challenge that didn't go unnoticed. Jasmine Crockett straightened her papers but didn't immediately respond. She had learned that silence, when timed correctly, could speak louder than 1,000 rebuttals. Her turn came a few minutes later, when the chair recognized her to speak. Her voice carried a quiet edge, firm but controlled. "Senator Graham," she began, "I appreciate your concern for consistency, but it seems the definition changes depending on who's sitting in the chair. The people are watching closely, and they can see the difference between accountability and selective outrage." The room shifted. That was the first spark. Graham smirked slightly. "Congresswoman, with all due respect, I've been doing this a lot longer than you. Passion doesn't equal proof." Crockett didn't blink. "And tenure doesn't equal truth." A few reporters in the back raised their eyebrows. It was clear. This wasn't going to be another polite exchange of sound bites. This was shaping up to be a televised showdown. The moderator tried to steer the discussion back to the prepared agenda, but the momentum had already turned. Crockett leaned forward, her tone sharpening as she continued. "If we're going to talk about double standards, Senator, then let's talk about them all. Let's talk about how investigations are framed depending on who the subject is. Let's talk about selective memory when it comes to defending certain individuals while demonizing others." Graham interjected. "Congresswoman, I understand the talking points." She cut in, her tone rising just slightly but unmistakably. "These aren't talking points, Senator. These are facts. The difference is, I don't dress mine up for applause." The audience reacted audibly this time. You could feel the tension stretch tight like a wire about to snap. Graham's expression stiffened, his southern politeness clashing with visible irritation. "Now hold on," he said, leaning in. "You're suggesting there's bias where there's clearly oversight. That's irresponsible, especially coming from someone in your position." "What's irresponsible," she replied, "is pretending bias doesn't exist because it's convenient to your narrative. Oversight doesn't mean oversight only when it's politically comfortable." The exchange was rapid fire now. No notes, no rehearsed lines, just two political heavyweights clashing in real time. It wasn't just disagreement, it was ideological collision. A senator nearby muttered under his breath. You could hear a pin drop. And he was right. Every whisper in the room had evaporated. Even the clicking of cameras had stopped as both figures held their ground. Then came a pause, a rare one. Graham exhaled slowly, collecting himself, before saying with deliberate calm, "You know, Congresswoman, I respect your passion. I really do. But this grandstanding isn't getting us any closer to the facts." Jasmine Crockett's response was swift and surgical. "Senator, if calling out hypocrisy is grandstanding, then maybe it's time this room got a better stage manager." A few muffled laughs escaped from the audience, though they were quickly stifled. Graham's face tightened. Crockett's eyes, however, didn't waver. She wasn't here to entertain, she was here to expose. In that moment, it was clear to everyone watching this wasn't about policy anymore. It was about power. and who got to define the truth in a room built to debate it. The moderator called for order, but the tension lingered, heavy and unresolved. Reporters were already drafting their headlines. Staffers whispered predictions about what would happen next. But the truth was, no one knew. Because Jasmine Crockett wasn't done. Not. The hearing room had become a silent theater of tension. Every pair of eyes followed Jasmine Crockett and Lindsey Graham like an audience caught in the middle of a courtroom drama. Cameras zoomed closer, microphones leaned forward, and every click of a pen seemed too loud. The moderator's gavel tapped lightly. "Let's maintain decorum, please," he said. But the word decorum had barely left his mouth before Crockett turned, her attention snapping back toward Graham. "Decorum," she repeated softly, almost to herself. Then louder, with clarity that carried across the chamber. "That word always seems to come up when a woman like me starts speaking too directly for comfort." A few heads turned. The comment wasn't just about tone. It was about history, about the way power often disguised itself behind rules of civility. Graham, ever the tactician, smiled faintly. "Congresswoman, no one's asking you not to speak. I'm just saying we could all use a little less heat and a little more light." Crockett tilted her head slightly, her expression unreadable. "Senator, light doesn't come without heat. The truth burns before it illuminates." There it was, the line that would echo across social media within minutes. Reporters in the back were already typing furiously. Hashtags were being born in real time. A Crockett Graham, Fithi truth burns, pin drop moment. But the Congresswoman wasn't done. She leaned forward, eyes locked on Graham. "You want less heat? Then maybe stop lighting the match every time accountability walks into the room." Graham's smirk faltered, replaced by a brief flicker of irritation. He had faced his share of tough debates before, but Crockett's composure was different. It was unwavering, methodical, and personal all at once. She didn't shout. She didn't waver. She cut. "Congresswoman," Graham replied, his voice steady but sharp, "if your goal is to score points for the cameras, you're doing a fine job. But this is about governance, not grandstanding." Jasmine Crockett didn't look away. Her tone stayed measured, her words slow and deliberate. "Senator, I don't need to score points for cameras. The truth scores itself. And if you're uncomfortable being confronted with it, maybe that says more about your position than mine." The audience murmured again. Some senators shifted uncomfortably, others looked impressed. The clash had transcended the hearing itself. It had become a battle of philosophies. Graham tried to regain control, leaning on his reputation for wit. "Look, I admire your conviction. Really. But politics isn't about feelings, it's about facts. You're confusing passion for proof." Crockett folded her arms calmly. "Then let's talk facts," she said. "Fact, when investigations were politically convenient, we heard constant cries for transparency. Fact, when those investigations started pointing the other way, suddenly, the system was being weaponized. Fact, when women of color in power speak up, we're called emotional instead of factual. So tell me, Senator, are those feelings or facts?" The words landed like a verdict. Graham opened his mouth to respond, but for the first time, he hesitated. The silence stretched out, long enough for the cameras to capture his pause, long enough for the audience to realize they were witnessing something rare, a moment when a seasoned politician found himself cornered not by aggression, but by precision. Finally, Graham sighed and replied, "Congresswoman, I respect your perspective, but you're personalizing a policy issue. We can't have progress if every discussion turns into a lecture about identity." Crockett's reply came almost instantly, but her tone softened, not out of surrender, but control. "Identity isn't a lecture, Senator, it's a lens. You can't fix a system you refuse to see clearly, and pretending that perspective doesn't matter is exactly how bias hides in plain sight." The moderator tried again to step in, but the exchange had taken on a rhythm of its own, sharp, steady, unstoppable. The two weren't just talking at each other, they were revealing a clash that reflected the larger state of American politics. The audience could feel it. This was more than a disagreement. It was a confrontation between two generations, two moral frameworks, two definitions of patriotism. Crockett leaned forward slightly, lowering her voice just enough to draw everyone in. "You keep asking for respect, Senator. I'll give it when it's mutual. But don't confuse respect with silence. I was elected to speak for people who don't get invited to these rooms. And I intend to keep doing that." There was no shouting, no theatrics. Just a statement of intent so strong it shook the room without raising the volume. Graham took a long breath. Well, Congresswoman, that's your right. And it's my right to say your approach divides rather than unites. Crockett looked at him steadily. Division doesn't start when truth is spoken. It starts when truth is ignored. That line sealed it. A low murmur rippled through the room again, the sound of history being recorded in whispers. For a moment Graham had no response. His expression softened, but his pride wouldn't let him yield completely. You've got a talent for headlines, he muttered, half to himself. Maybe that's what politics has become. Crockett smiled faintly, her voice barely above a whisper but sharp enough to cut through the air. Maybe headlines wouldn't matter so much if accountability didn't make people flinch. A stunned hush fell again. The moderator, realizing there was no easy way to transition, called for a 5-minute recess. But no one in the room moved. The silence itself seemed like part of the record. Graham leaned back, his expression caught somewhere between frustration and reluctant respect. Crockett remained composed, reviewing her notes as though nothing unusual had happened. It was clear she hadn't come to perform, she'd come to make a point, and she had. As aides began whispering behind them, one journalist near the aisle typed the words that would define the day. You could hear a pin drop when Jasmine Crockett finished. Outside the chamber, the story had already gone viral. Clips of the exchange were circulating across every platform. Viewers argued online, some calling her fearless, others calling her too confrontational. But no one could deny one thing: Jasmine Crockett had changed the temperature in the room. Permanently. And as the break ended and the gavel called everyone back, there was a sense that the storm hadn't passed, it had just shifted. Both sides were ready. The next round wasn't going to be about tone anymore. It was going to be about truth, point by point, the calm before the next wave. When the committee reconvened after the recess, the atmosphere had changed. The air was thicker, the whispers sharper, and every movement in the room carried the weight of what had just unfolded. Lindsey Graham returned to his seat with the calm of a man determined to regain control. Jasmine Crockett, meanwhile, walked back in without looking around, her stride steady, eyes fixed on the stack of notes she didn't need to read. The audience could sense it. This wasn't over. It had only just begun. The gavel struck again. The hearing will come back to order, said the moderator, his tone betraying a hint of tension. Graham was the first to speak, his voice even but calculated. Before we proceed, he began, I'd like to remind my colleagues that this chamber has a long tradition of respectful debate. We can disagree passionately without turning this place into a spectacle. He didn't name names, but everyone knew who he meant. The subtle dig was as visible as the cameras aimed squarely at him. Crockett didn't react immediately. She flipped a page, took a slow sip of water and waited. The silence that followed wasn't accidental, it was strategic. She knew timing was everything. Then she spoke. Senator Graham, with all due respect, what you call a spectacle, I call a reckoning. The words hung in the air. She continued, her tone measured but cutting. You've sat in this chamber for years defending accountability when it suited you, and ignoring it when it didn't. The public deserves consistency, not selective outrage dressed up as principle. Graham straightened slightly, his jaw tightening. Congresswoman, that's a serious accusation. I've defended the rule of law whether it was convenient or not. You can check the record. She nodded slowly. Oh, I have checked the record. And that's exactly what we're about to discuss. You could feel the room shift again. Crockett wasn't improvising now, she was building a case. She reached for a document and lifted it for the record. Let's talk about 2016, she began, her voice clear and unwavering. When you defended blocking a Supreme Court nomination under the claim that the American people should decide. Then 4 years later, you reversed yourself when the power dynamic shifted. So tell me, Senator, was that about principle or convenience? A few audible gasps rippled through the audience. Graham's face stiffened. That's politics, Congresswoman. The majority governs. You'd do the same if the shoe were on the other foot. Crockett leaned forward, eyes unflinching. No, Senator. I wouldn't justify contradiction as tradition. Because when the rules only matter when they favor you, they stop being rules, they become weapons. The blow landed hard. Even those who disagreed with her could feel the precision of her words. Graham clasped his hands, his voice dipping lower. It's easy to moralize from the sidelines, Congresswoman, but governing means making hard choices. Sometimes the ideal world doesn't align with reality, she countered instantly. Reality isn't an excuse for hypocrisy, Senator. It's the reason integrity matters even more. A silence followed so heavy that even the air conditioners seemed to pause. It wasn't yelling. It wasn't chaos. It was clarity. And that made it more dangerous than shouting ever could be. Graham leaned back, perhaps realizing that interruption would only make things worse. He'd underestimated her poise before, he wouldn't again. Crockett pressed on. You keep talking about unity. But unity without honesty is performance. And people see through performance now. They're tired of being told to stay calm while truth gets buried under procedure. Her tone was steady, but her words carried a rising intensity that filled the chamber. Every phrase seemed to slice through layers of pretense. Graham tried to respond, but Crockett wasn't finished. You say this hearing is about oversight. So let's have some. Let's oversee the way power has been used, not just by the people we oppose, but by the people sitting in these very chairs. That's the real accountability you claim to want. Graham exhaled slowly, his patience thinning but his composure intact. Congresswoman, you're making this personal. She shook her head. No, Senator. The policies are personal. The hypocrisy is personal. The decisions we make here echo into people's lives. And pretending otherwise is the luxury of those who've never had to live with their consequences. That line drew quiet nods from several in the gallery. Some of Graham's colleagues avoided eye contact altogether. Others, including a few across the aisle, looked almost impressed. Crockett's voice softened, but her conviction deepened. I didn't come here to argue for applause. I came here because people outside this building don't have microphones. And every time we downplay the truth for the sake of decorum, we prove why they stopped trusting us in the first place. For a moment Graham didn't respond. He looked at her, studying her face, as though trying to find the flaw in her argument, the weak spot that every debater searches for. But it wasn't there. Finally, he said, I'll give you this. Congresswoman, you're articulate. But you're also idealistic. Politics isn't about purity, it's about survival. Crockett gave a faint smile. Then maybe survival isn't the goal anymore. Maybe the goal is decency. The crowd shifted again. That line, simple, unflinching, summed up the entire exchange. Graham's expression hardened, but his tone softened. You've got fire, I'll give you that. But someday you'll learn that this place doesn't reward purity. It punishes it. Crockett met his gaze. Maybe. But if the truth is punished, that says more about the system than it does about me. It was the kind of response that left no room for comeback. The moderator cleared his throat, unsure how to steer the moment. We'll proceed with final statements soon, he said hesitantly. But Crockett wasn't quite done. She leaned forward one last time. Senator, you've spent decades here defining the rules. Maybe it's time someone rewrote them. Graham didn't reply. He simply looked at her for a long, silent moment, half admiration, half resistance. The air in the chamber was electric. No one moved, no one whispered. It was one of those rare political moments that felt raw and unscripted, like truth had finally slipped past protocol and taken the mic for itself. When the moderator finally called for a recess, the crowd erupted into a low hum of disbelief. Some clapped quietly, others stared, stunned. Outside, reporters were already swarming the steps, microphones ready. Within minutes, clips from the exchange began flooding social feeds, gathering millions of views. Headlines exploded. Crockett confronts Graham in explosive exchange. Jasmine Crockett redefines respect in fiery debate. You could hear a pin drop. Crockett's words shake the chamber. Inside, Graham stayed seated for a moment longer, staring at the table. He wasn't defeated, but he knew he'd met an opponent who didn't play by the old rules. And Jasmine Crockett. She gathered her notes, calm as ever, and walked out of the room with the quiet confidence of someone who knew she had said exactly what she came to say. The tide had turned, and everyone in that building knew it. By the time the sun dipped behind the Capitol dome, the hearing room was nearly empty. The once crowded chamber, filled with flashing cameras, whispered commentary, and the tension of a political thunderstorm, now sat in heavy silence. But the world outside was anything but quiet. In less than an hour, every major network had replayed the confrontation. Hashtags flooded social platforms for Crockett goes off, pen drop moment for truth burns, and the most viral of them all, for Crockett vs. Graham. Clips of Jasmine Crockett's sharp, deliberate words were being dissected on talk shows, podcasts, and news panels. For some she had become a symbol of moral clarity. For others, a sign of political boldness crossing the line. But everyone agreed on one thing: they'd just witnessed something unforgettable. Back inside the building, The echo of the debate still lingered like smoke after a fire. Lindsey Graham sat in his office, hands clasped loosely together, watching the replay on mute. The expression on his face was complicated, part defiance, part reflection. He'd been in Washington long enough to survive more than one verbal battle. He'd debated presidents, defended wars, outlasted scandals. But this one felt different. It wasn't that Jasmine Crockett had humiliated him. She hadn't tried to. It was that she'd challenged him without fear, with the kind of precision that stripped away rhetoric and left only truth behind. She hadn't raised her voice. She hadn't grandstanded. And yet, somehow she had turned the entire chamber into a mirror, forcing everyone, even him, to look into it. A soft knock on his door interrupted the silence. His aide stepped in. "Senator, there are about 20 interview requests regarding the hearing. CNN, Fox, MSNBC, everyone wants your reaction." Graham exhaled slowly. "Tell them I'll think about it," he said. "Sometimes silence speaks louder than spin." The aide nodded and slipped out quietly. Graham leaned back, closing his eyes for a moment. He wasn't angry, at least, not anymore. There was something unsettling about the calmness that had followed the clash. Because deep down he knew she'd struck a chord that the country needed to hear. Across town, Jasmine Crockett sat in her own office, surrounded by half-drunk coffee cups and a phone that hadn't stopped buzzing. Messages from colleagues, activists, journalists, even strangers. Some thanked her for speaking truth to power. Others warned her she'd made enemies. But she didn't seem shaken. Instead, she sat quietly, scrolling through messages she'd ignored during the chaos. One, in particular, made her stop. It was from a teacher in Georgia. "My students watched you today. For the first time they said Congress looked like them and spoke for them. Thank you." Crockett smiled faintly. That was the only validation she needed. Her aide poked her head in. "Congresswoman, the press wants a statement. What do you want me to tell them?" Crockett thought for a moment. Then, calmly, she said, "Tell them I said what needed to be said, and that I meant every word." The aide nodded, understanding the weight behind that simple sentence. Outside her window, the Capitol glowed under floodlights, looking both timeless and fragile. Crockett knew the storm she'd just unleashed wouldn't pass quietly. But she hadn't run for office to play safe. She'd come to remind people that truth still mattered, even when it was uncomfortable. By evening, the story dominated every major outlet. Pundits debated her tone, her composure, her courage. Some called her the conscience of the chamber. Others accused her of breaking protocol. But nobody could ignore her. Clips of her exchange with Graham were stitched into montages online, her lines turned into quotes and captions, her calm stare frozen mid-sentence, as commentators dissected every pause and word. One late-night host said it best. You could see it on Graham's face. He realized halfway through that this wasn't politics anymore. It was accountability. On social media, millions watched the replay. Young voters in particular resonated with Crockett's balance of grace and grit. Memes turned her quotes into digital protest art. Hashtags trended in multiple countries. Meanwhile in Washington, insiders whispered that Graham's team was rethinking his media approach, while Crockett's team couldn't keep up with the surge of interview requests, podcast invites, and endorsement offers. But Jasmine Crockett didn't care about fame. What she cared about was resonance, the kind that didn't fade with the news cycle. Days later, when the frenzy had begun to cool, an unexpected thing happened. Lindsey Graham approached Jasmine Crockett in the hallway outside another committee room. No cameras, no press. Just two lawmakers crossing paths. He offered a small, polite nod. "Congresswoman," he said. Crockett turned, slightly cautious. "Senator." He hesitated for a second, then said quietly, "You know, I've been in this town a long time. I've seen a lot of people talk loud and say nothing. He paused. "You said something." Crockett looked at him, surprised but respectful. "I said what I had to?" Graham nodded. "Yeah, and maybe it needed to be said." There was no handshake, no photo op, just a brief acknowledgement, an unspoken truce built not on agreement, but on recognition. They both walked away knowing that moment, raw and public as it was, had shaken something loose inside that chamber. Maybe even inside themselves. Weeks later, the debate had entered political lore. Commentators replayed it every time a new controversy arose about honesty, decorum, or accountability. Students analyzed it in civics classes. Journalists called it turning point in congressional discourse. Activists cited it as proof that dignity and defiance could coexist. For Jasmine Crockett, it wasn't about glory, it was about impact. She had no illusions that one debate could fix everything. But she believed that words, when spoken with conviction, could start a chain reaction of courage in others. And Lindsey Graham, he continued his work, still fiery, still political, but quieter, more reflective. Every so often, when he stood at the podium and spoke about the importance of truth in politics, a faint echo of that day could be heard beneath his words. Because deep down, even he knew, that hearing had changed something. Not just for her, for him, for everyone who'd been listening. Months later, during an interview, Jasmine Crockett was asked if she regretted anything she said that day. She smiled. "No," she said simply. "I didn't go off. I spoke up. And maybe that's what scared people." The interviewer asked, "What do you think the silence in that room meant when you said those words?" And it felt like time stopped. Crockett thought for a long moment before answering. "Silence," she said, "isn't always disagreement. Sometimes it's the sound of truth landing." And with that, she looked directly into the camera. The same steady, unflinching gaze that had once silenced a room full of senators, and smiled. Outside, the world was still arguing about politics. But for once, they were arguing about something that mattered. Because when Jasmine Crockett went off on Lindsey Graham, it wasn't just a debate. It was a moment when truth refused to whisper. And you could still hear that pin drop.